Distinguished viewers, imagine you are a radar operator at a Canadian Armed Forces installation in Northern Ontario on a cold February morning in 2029. Your shift begins at 0600 hours. You settle into your station, coffee in hand, and watch the displays come to life. Multiple screens show a map of Canada's northern approaches, the Arctic archipelago stretching toward the North Pole, the vast empty spaces where Russian bombers and Chinese submarines might operate without detection. But this morning, something is different. A new system has just gone operational. The Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar, a $6 billion partnership between Canada and Australia that uses technology so advanced it sounds like science fiction. The radar does not look straight ahead like conventional systems. Instead, it fires electromagnetic pulses upward toward the ionosphere. That layer of charged particles 70 to 400 kilometers above Earth's surface. The pulses bounce off the ionosphere and reflect back down to Earth 3,000 kilometers away, far beyond the curve of the horizon that limits traditional radar. Then the echoes bounce back up to the ionosphere again and return to a separate receiving station where you sit, processing the data in real time. This means you can see Russian military aircraft taking off from bases in Siberia before they reach Canadian airspace. You can track Chinese submarines surfacing in international waters north of Alaska. You can monitor cruise missiles launched from ships in the Arctic Ocean while they are still thousands of kilometers from Canadian cities. You have domain awareness that Canadian commanders have never possessed before. The Arctic is no longer a black hole where adversaries can operate unseen. It is monitored, tracked, and defended with technology that gives Canada and the United States the early warning time necessary to respond to threats before they reach North American airspace. This is not a future scenario. This is the capability that Prime Minister Mark Carney announced in March 2025 when he traveled to Iqaluit, Nunavut, immediately after his first international trips to London and Paris. Standing in Canada's Arctic capital, Carney declared that Canada would partner with Australia to develop the Arctic Over-the-Horizon Radar System, an investment of more than $6 billion over 20 years in what he called the most advanced and efficient radar system available anywhere in the world. The timing of Carney's announcement was not coincidental. He had just returned from meetings with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, where they discussed the deteriorating security environment in the Arctic and the urgent need for NATO allies to strengthen their northern defenses. Russia had been expanding its Arctic military infrastructure for years, building bases, deploying icebreakers, and conducting bomber patrols that tested North American air defenses. China had declared itself a near-Arctic state, despite being geographically distant from the region, and was investing heavily in icebreaker construction and resource partnerships with Russia. And most alarmingly, both countries were developing hypersonic missiles, weapons that could fly at 5 times the speed of sound and change course mid-flight, making them nearly impossible to intercept with existing defense systems. In July 2025, United States and Canadian forces intercepted Russian and Chinese bombers flying together near Alaska. This was not a one-time incident. It was part of a pattern of increasing coordination between Russia and China in the Arctic that the United States Department of Defense warned had the potential to alter the Arctic's stability and threat picture. For Canadian military planners, these developments created an impossible situation. Canada's existing radar coverage in the Arctic came from the North Warning System, a network of ground-based radars built in the 1980s to detect Soviet bombers flying over the North Pole. But the North Warning System could only see a few hundred kilometers. Hypersonic missiles and advanced cruise missiles with stealth capabilities could penetrate Canadian airspace without being detected until it was too late to respond. Canada needed over-the-horizon radar capability urgently, but developing such technology from scratch would take decades and cost tens of billions of dollars. The solution was to partner with Australia, which had been operating the world's most advanced over-the-horizon radar network for 30 years. Australia's Jindalee Operational Radar Network, known as JORN, protected Australia's northern approaches by bouncing radar signals off the ionosphere to detect aircraft and ships thousands of kilometers away. The technology worked, it was proven, and Australia was willing to share it with Canada as part of deepening defense cooperation between the two countries. The Canada-Australia Radar Partnership represented a strategic pivot in Canadian defense policy, with implications far beyond the Arctic. For decades, Canada had relied almost exclusively on the United States for military technology and intelligence. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, was a joint Canada-United States organization that defended the continent against airborne threats. Canadian defense procurement typically meant buying American equipment, American aircraft, American weapons systems. This arrangement had advantages. American technology was proven, American production capacity could deliver quickly, American interoperability meant Canadian forces could operate seamlessly alongside United States allies. But it also created dependence. When Donald Trump threatened to annex Canada and suggested that Canadian sovereignty was negotiable, Canadian military planners faced an uncomfortable question. If relations with the United States deteriorated seriously, could Canada defend its own territory independently? The answer was uncomfortable. Canada's military capabilities were built on the assumption of permanent American cooperation. If that cooperation ended or became conditional on political demands Canada could not accept, Canadian sovereignty would be exposed as hollow. The partnership with Australia offered an alternative model. Australia was a trusted ally with shared values, democratic governance, and similar security challenges. Australia faced China's growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region. Canada faced Russia's expansion in the Arctic and China's interest in northern shipping routes. Both countries needed advanced surveillance technology to monitor vast ocean approaches, where conventional radar was useless. By partnering with Australia, Canada diversified its defense relationships away from exclusive dependence on the United States. If Trump or a future American president tried to use military cooperation as leverage to extract political concessions, Canada would have options. The Arctic over-the-horizon radar would be built regardless of American preferences. It would enhance NORAD capabilities, but it would be Canadian-owned infrastructure using Australian technology. This was sovereignty in practice, not just rhetoric. General Jennie Carignan, Canada's Chief of the Defence Staff, emphasized this point in her public statement about the radar partnership. The Arctic over-the-horizon radar system is a vital step in strengthening Canada's ability to defend its territory and assert its sovereignty in the north. By significantly enhancing long-range detection and domain awareness, this capability will ensure the Canadian Armed Forces and NORAD remain prepared to address emerging threats and safeguard our nation and continent. The technical specifications of the radar system revealed why it represented such a leap in capability. Traditional radar operates by sending electromagnetic waves that travel in straight lines and reflect off objects. But Earth's curvature limits how far those waves can travel before they disappear over the horizon. For radar on the ground, that limit is roughly 300 to 400 kilometers, depending on antenna height and atmospheric conditions. Beyond that distance, radar is blind. Over-the-horizon radar solves this problem by using the ionosphere as a mirror. The transmitter fires high-frequency radio waves upward at an angle. When these waves reach the ionosphere, they reflect back down to Earth at a shallow angle, traveling another 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers before hitting the ground. If an aircraft or ship is in that illumination zone, the radar waves reflect off it and bounce back to the ionosphere, which reflects them again down to the receiving station. By analyzing the time delay and frequency shift of these echoes, operators can determine the location, speed, and direction of targets 3,000 kilometers away. The Canadian Arctic over-the-horizon radar system would consist of two geographically separated installations. The transmitter would be located at one site, firing radar pulses upward toward the ionosphere. The receiver would be located hundreds of kilometers away, collecting the echoes that bounced back. Both installations would feature massive antenna arrays stretching over 1.3 kilometers, processing enormous amounts of data to filter out noise and identify actual targets among the clutter. The system would be based in southern Ontario, but its coverage would extend from the Canada-United States border northward across the entire Arctic archipelago to the North Pole and beyond. For the first time in Canadian history, military commanders would have real-time situational awareness of everything moving through Canada's northern approaches. Royal Canadian Air Force. Major General Chris McKenna, head of Canadian NORAD region, described the capability gap that the new radar would fill. Speaking at a conference in March 2025, McKenna said, "We need a layered sensing grid from the seafloor to the space layer. And we have no choice. And it has to be layered and deep, a defense in depth from a sensing point of view. And I will say I suffer from an insufficiency of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the Arctic on a daily basis. And I am fighting for information. McKenna's frustration captured the reality that Canadian commanders had been operating blind in the Arctic for decades. They knew Russian bombers conducted regular patrols. They knew Chinese submarines were operating in international waters. They knew both countries were developing weapons designed to evade existing detection systems. But knowing these threats existed was different from being able to track them in real time and respond effectively. The Arctic over-the-horizon radar would transform that situation by providing the information McKenna needed to do his job. But the radar announcement sparked controversy within Canada's defense industry. DTA Systems, an Ottawa-based company that had been developing over-the-horizon radar technology with government funding, expressed bitter disappointment at being overlooked in favor of Australian technology. Deepak Roy, chairman of DTA Systems, argued that choosing foreign technology over domestic expertise undermined Canada's industrial capabilities and created dependence on international supply chains for maintenance and upgrades. The criticism had merit. Building domestic defense technology capacity was strategically valuable. Canadian companies employing Canadian engineers could maintain and improve systems without relying on foreign suppliers. But the urgency of the threat outweighed these considerations. Canada needed over-the-horizon radar capabilities operational by 2029, not 2045. Australia's JORN technology was proven and could be adapted quickly. Developing Canadian technology from scratch would take decades and might not achieve the same performance. The decision to partner with Australia rather than wait for domestic development reflected the seriousness of the threat environment. General Carignan's warning in 2024 that Canada had approximately 5 years to prepare to meet new long-range threats from Russia and China was not rhetoric. It was operational assessment based on intelligence about adversary capabilities. Hypersonic missiles were not theoretical weapons that might exist someday. They were being tested and deployed. Russia's Kinzhal hypersonic missile had been used in combat in Ukraine. China's DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle was operational. Both systems could reach targets in North America within minutes of launch, and existing missile defense systems had no reliable way to intercept them. The only effective response was early detection, combined with layered defenses that could attempt multiple intercepts as the missile approached. Over-the-horizon radar provided that early detection capability. Consider what detection 3,000 kilometers away actually means in military terms. A Russian bomber taking off from a base in Siberia would be tracked immediately as it entered the radar coverage zone. Canadian commanders would have hours to scramble interceptor aircraft, coordinate with American forces, and prepare responses before the bomber reached Canadian airspace. A cruise missile launched from a submarine in the Arctic Ocean would be detected while still far from its target, providing time to activate missile defense systems and evacuate critical facilities if necessary. A hypersonic missile launched from Russia toward North American targets would be tracked throughout its flight, giving commanders the maximum possible warning time, even though interception might not be feasible with current technology. This early warning was the foundation of deterrence and defense. Adversaries knew that surprise attacks were much harder to execute when their preparations and launches were immediately visible to defenders. The political dimension of the radar partnership extended beyond military capability. By deepening cooperation with Australia, Canada was strengthening the informal alliance of English-speaking democracies, sometimes called CANZUK. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. These countries shared intelligence, coordinated defense policies, and increasingly operated as a bloc within NATO and other international organizations. The radar deal drew interest from the United Kingdom, which was reportedly considering acquiring JORN technology to bolster its own Arctic and Indo-Pacific defense strategies. If Britain proceeded, the three countries would share a common radar technology base, facilitating intelligence sharing and coordinated responses to threats. This was exactly the kind of diversified alliance structure that made Canada less dependent on United States preferences and more capable of independent action. For Nunavut residents, the radar announcement came bundled with other investments that demonstrated federal commitment to the Arctic. Carney announced $420 million in new funding to establish a year-round military presence in the Arctic, ending the historical pattern of seasonal attention followed by winter neglect. An additional $253 million would upgrade power plants in Cambridge Bay, Joa Haven, Igloolik, and Iqaluit. providing reliable electricity for communities and military installations. These infrastructure investments were necessary prerequisites for sustained military operations. But Nunavut MP Lori Idlout raised concerns that the federal government's focus on international partnerships and military spending was disproportionate to investments in northern communities. She pointed out that $6 billion for radar technology dwarfed the $253 million allocated for Nunavut infrastructure. It's frustrating that Canada is promising to invest more in another country's capabilities rather than its own people, Idlout said. The criticism highlighted tensions between military imperatives and community needs. Both were legitimate priorities, but resources were finite. Military planners argued that sovereignty required demonstrated capability to detect and respond to threats. Without effective defenses, Canadian claims to Arctic territory would be empty words. Community advocates argued that sovereignty also required thriving communities with adequate infrastructure, education, and economic opportunities. Defending empty territory was pointless if Canadian citizens could not actually live there. The most effective Arctic strategy would integrate both dimensions, using military infrastructure to support community development and vice versa. Radar installations needed reliable power, which meant upgrading community electrical systems. Military personnel needed housing and services, which meant building community infrastructure. Indigenous employment in military and defense industry roles provided income and skills that benefited communities economically, while strengthening national security through local knowledge and presence. Carney's announcements in Iqaluit attempted to balance these priorities by combining the $6 billion radar partnership with the $420 million for military presence and $253 million for community infrastructure. Whether this balance was adequate remained contested, but the direction was clear. Arctic policy was no longer characterized by neglect and empty promises. Canada was making substantial investments in both defense capability and community infrastructure. For Russia, watching Canada deploy over-the-horizon radar capability in partnership with Australia represented a significant strategic setback. Russian military planning for potential conflicts with NATO had long assumed that North American early warning systems had limited Arctic coverage. Russian bombers could operate in the high Arctic with relative freedom, testing defenses and preparing strike routes that might be used in crisis or war. The Arctic over-the-horizon radar would eliminate that freedom of maneuver. Russian aircraft operating anywhere in the Arctic would be tracked continuously. Russian submarines surfacing near Canadian waters would be detected. Russian missile launches would be identified immediately, providing maximum warning time for North American defenses. Russian military planners would need to assume that surprise was no longer achievable in the Arctic, which fundamentally altered the strategic calculus. China faced similar implications. Chinese interest in the Arctic was primarily economic, focused on shipping routes and resource access. But China was also developing military capabilities that could threaten North America from northern approaches. Chinese submarines were increasingly sophisticated. Chinese bombers had the range to operate in the Arctic with Russian cooperation, and Chinese hypersonic missiles represented a growing threat to North American targets. The Arctic over-the-horizon radar would make Chinese military operations in the Arctic far more difficult and risky by ensuring they would be detected and tracked. For both Russia and China, the message was unmistakable. Canada was no longer a weak link in North American defenses. Canadian Arctic airspace was monitored by advanced technology. Canadian sovereignty was backed by capability, not just claims. And Canada was building diversified partnerships with allies beyond the United States, making it harder to exploit potential fractures in Western alliances. The contrast with Donald Trump's approach to Arctic security was stark and deliberate. Trump had threatened to annex Greenland, alienating Denmark, and undermining NATO solidarity in the Arctic. He had suggested that Canada should become the 51st state, insulting Canadian sovereignty and creating distrust. He had imposed tariffs on Canadian goods while expecting Canadian cooperation on defense issues. Trump's strategy assumed that American military dominance gave the United States leverage to demand concessions from allies. But that assumption only worked if allies had no alternatives. By partnering with Australia on radar technology, by diversifying trade relationships with China and Qatar in Europe, by investing in Arctic infrastructure independently of American preferences, Canada was demonstrating that alternatives existed. Trump's threats strengthened rather than weakened Canadian resolve to build sovereignty through capability. Every insult from Trump became justification for Canadian investments in independent defense infrastructure. Every tariff announcement motivated Canadian efforts to reduce dependence on American markets. Every suggestion that Canadian sovereignty was negotiable proved why Canada needed military capabilities that did not rely on American goodwill. When the Arctic over-the-horizon radar becomes operational in 2029, Canadian radar operators will sit at their stations in southern Ontario and watch their screens display aircraft and ships 3,000 kilometers away in the high Arctic. They will see Russian bombers taking off from Siberian bases. They will track Chinese submarines operating north of Alaska. They will monitor cruise missiles and hypersonic threats as they enter the coverage zone. And they will know that Canada possesses the technology and capability to defend its territory independently of whether the United States chooses to cooperate or threaten. That capability is sovereignty, not flags planted on ice, not speeches about Arctic importance, not diplomatic protests when foreign powers operate in Canadian waters. Actual operational capability to detect threats, respond to challenges, and enforce Canadian control over Canadian territory. The $6 billion investment in the Arctic over-the-horizon radar partnership with Australia represents one of the most significant sovereignty achievements in Canadian history. Russian military planners would need to assume that surprise was no longer achievable in the Arctic, which fundamentally altered the strategic calculus. China faced similar implications. Chinese interest in the Arctic was primarily economic, focused on shipping routes and resource access. But China was also developing military capabilities that could threaten North America from northern approaches. Chinese submarines were increasingly sophisticated. Chinese bombers had the range to operate in the Arctic with Russian cooperation. And Chinese hypersonic missiles represented a growing threat to North American targets. The Arctic over-the-horizon radar would make Chinese military operations in the Arctic far more difficult and risky by ensuring they would be detected and tracked. For both Russia and China, the message was unmistakable. Canada was no longer a weak link in North American defenses. Canadian Arctic airspace was monitored by advanced technology. Canadian sovereignty was backed by capability, not just claims. And Canada was building diversified partnerships with allies beyond the United States, making it harder to exploit potential fractures in Western alliances. The contrast with Donald Trump's approach to Arctic security was stark and deliberate. Trump had threatened to annex Greenland, alienating Denmark and undermining NATO solidarity in the Arctic. He had suggested that Canada should become the 51st state, insulting Canadian sovereignty and creating distrust. He had imposed tariffs on Canadian goods while expecting Canadian cooperation on defense issues. Trump's strategy assumed that American military dominance gave the United States leverage to demand concessions from allies. But that assumption only worked if allies had no alternatives. By partnering with Australia on radar technology, by diversifying trade relationships with China and Qatar in Europe, by investing in Arctic infrastructure independently of American preferences, Canada was demonstrating that alternatives existed. Trump's threats strengthened rather than weakened Canadian resolve to build sovereignty through capability. Every insult from Trump became justification for Canadian investments in independent defense infrastructure. Every tariff announcement motivated Canadian efforts to reduce dependence on American markets. Every suggestion that Canadian sovereignty was negotiable proved why Canada needed military capabilities that did not rely on American goodwill. When the Arctic over-the-horizon radar becomes operational in 2029, Canadian radar operators will sit at their stations in southern Ontario and watch their screens display aircraft and ships 3,000 kilometers away in the high Arctic. They will see Russian bombers taking off from Siberian bases. They will track Chinese submarines operating north of Alaska. They will monitor cruise missiles and hypersonic threats as they enter the coverage zone. And they will know that Canada possesses the technology and capability to defend its territory independently of whether the United States chooses to cooperate or threaten. That capability is sovereignty, not flags planted on ice, not speeches about Arctic importance, not diplomatic protests when foreign powers operate in Canadian waters. Actual operational capability to detect threats, respond to challenges, and enforce Canadian control over Canadian territory. The $6 billion investment in the Arctic over-the-horizon radar partnership with Australia represents one of the most significant sovereignty achievements in Canadian history.